Just by existing, graffiti calls into question the relationship that marginalized communities have with the law and the infrastructures imposed on them. This is made even more evident by looking at the opposite side of the coin. This work by well-known street artist Banksy was done on the side of a private garage and attracted thousands of visitors, and is currently being protected by the owner. Is Banksy's work just so much inherently better than local graffiti artists that it merits all the attention it gets? Banksy's work certainly takes a stylistic departure from traditional graffiti, but the action itself is the same. So why isn't law enforcement sent to investigate Banksy, but will send black and brown kids to jail for doing the same? Is it because the officers are acutely aware of the tribulations of the contemporary art world? Of course not. Arguably, Banksy has found a way to bring legitimacy to the art form, but criticisms of his work tend to take a more gentrification angle on the issue, and I tend to agree. Additionally, many of the Black Lives Matter murals have been left up by city officials, or even commissioned by the city, but these actions do nothing to meet the demands of the protesters. Oftentimes, they're commissioned in a vain attempt to stave off protests without making any attempt at systemic change. As soon as the art becomes a community asset, the law looks the other way. Banksy's graffiti adding value to the community is a result of the same cost-benefit analysis that the United States government took to decide it'd be a much better look to support MLK's ideas. But only posthumously, of course. Graffiti gives us a clear look at the relationship that personal narrative takes in the context of an abusive power system. But how to bridge the gap? How do you reconcile centuries of systemic inequality with people who are finally finding the platform to speak out against it? Specifically in the context of the current civil rights movement, nonviolence is always a noble effort. But the principle of nonviolence relies on the aggressor recognizing the futility of hitting somebody who won't hit back. In other words, nonviolence relies on the moral consciousness of the oppressor. Police who are armed to the teeth with military-grade equipment are not taught to act on their moral conscience. And when someone's moral conscience has been shaped by a carefully manicured American narrative that's designed to skim over the atrocities committed in the name of freedom and to distance those acts from the present, everyone becomes an unreliable narrator. Nonviolence relies on an inherent faith in a collective we, and that everyone is fundamentally on the same side, which is a trust we've seen broken over and over and over again. While we're all connected by our humanity, and unjust individuals can be brought back into the sense of inherent humanity, that does not change the system at large. That choice to come back to humanity strengthens everyone, but that choice still has to be made. Sorry. To begin to dissect the inequality perpetuated by this narrative, the ways in which the overarching American narrative has shaped individual ideas has to be dissected and rebuilt. As David Ragland, co-director of the Truth Telling Project, put it, reconciliation means we had to have something first. To reconcile with someone, there has to have been some sort of relationship that was damaged by the conflict and needs to be repaired through reconciliation. Systemic inequality is not a violation of a mutual relationship. In abstraction, it's the result of micro-entitlements that allow such a system to be constructed in the first place. An entitlement is a result of one group being forced to yield power to the other. Thus, the well-intentioned idea of reconciliation falls apart in response to issues of systemic inequality. The fact of the matter is, there's just nothing to reconcile to. Retribution, however, isn't subject to the same two-way street approach that reconciliation is. Frequently spoken of as justice in the current context, retribution is the oppressing group yielding to the other as a form of recompense. The most compassionate family in the world can never reconcile with the police officer who killed their child if the officer doesn't regret it, but by charging the officer with murder and sending him to jail, the family at least had the legal reassurance that while the death was unjust, the criminal still faced punishment. But in the absence of that justice, no one in this situation is in a position to do anything to rectify the conflict. This struggle between reconciling the lives of individuals within the context of larger narratives is what creates freedom. If someone is oppressed, then for whatever reason they don't have power. The system around them has stripped them of some sort of autonomy. They'd be considered unfree. But if someone is not oppressed, then they have the autonomy to do as they please, and then they are considered free. If we take the position that being unfree is to have power taken away from you, then being free must be the ability to wield that power, or, as it's more frequently called, privilege. This is how people can belong to so many group identities, race, gender, sexuality, religion, etc., but still face adversity in one or more facets of their identity. Framing freedom as advocacy is particularly important to the view of identity-based conflict because it allows for individuals and groups to campaign for freedom on their own terms. For example, last March, Virginia passed a bill that gives drivers the options to mark their driver's license with non-binary if they feel that the traditional gender markers do not fit them. While this is well-intentioned, it creates a subcategory of people that can be specifically targeted by abuse of authority figures. Additionally, being a binary trans person, having my legal gender marked on my license puts me at risk. Looking the way I do and having an F marked as my sex, best case scenario, it looks like I have a fake ID. This isn't freedom, it's a hazard. The reality is that there's no legal reason to have a gender on a license. This is a perspective that I and many others take when considering the situation on our own terms. Because medically speaking, if someone gets into an accident, their blood type would be much more useful information than what's in between their pants. The individual experiences of real people affected by this legislation weren't considered in the context of the larger system we live in. Think of it this way. The authorities have the freedom to continue perpetuating their power, so creating freedom for individual groups takes some of that power away from them. In conclusion, go vote. Really, the only way to create a place for your identity in your community is to be vocal about your narrative. So get active, go to protests, sign petitions, organize community events, and make your voice heard. Political movements, like any other group, are based on the interconnections of experiences, and just like the guys at the movie theater, the only way that you find those interconnections is by communicating them to others. So even if your demographic is already represented in whatever local bureaucracy applies to you, advocate for others. If our government really is of, for, and by the people, then we, the people, should take advantage of a system that's supposed to be built for us. One ripple in the water doesn't flood the shore. It takes mass action to change an unjust system.